to go back to our overview, we said we were going to talk about 4 things. So we talked about what fits in our head. We talked about narrowing types. And the 2 other things we're going to talk about are enforcement arguments and using modules for modularity. So let's talk about enforcement arguments first. So one of the things we talked about here was the idea of our arguments to these functions being used as a way for us to sort of traverse our code and understand the dependencies between different parts of our code base. So one of the ways we can do that is when we're debugging or making modifications. We can actually do that when we're creating things as well. When we're setting something up new from the beginning, we can actually use it as a way to introduce intentional dependencies between parts of our code that are not necessarily related if we choose the narrowest possible types. So let me give you an example of this. The most canonical example of this is cred. Now, there are a couple of different functions in here there are a couple of different messages in here that don't have any cred associated with them. In fact, there's only one that does. That's called clicked save. The reason clicked save has cred associated with it is twofold. Number one, when we're in the article editor, we should be logged in as the user. Like, there's no possible way that we should be able to get to this page and not be logged in. And it's theoretically possible in the sense that the compiler doesn't rule it out. But if we did somehow get logged in, if we did somehow get to the new article or the edit article page without being logged in, something probably went wrong at some point. So essentially, the point of having this argument in here is to say, when you click save, we need credentials. Even if on the rest of the page we don't have the ability to necessarily extract our credentials, because the session stores credentials as a maybe, in the sense that you may or may not be logged in, depending on what page you're on, or depending on whether or not you've logged in for any given page. But in the particular case of save, in order to successfully make an HTTP post that's going to get authenticated on the server that's going to succeed, you have to provide credentials to it. That's just part of the API. It's not going to succeed if you don't provide those credentials. So putting it in click save means that we don't have to look into our model and try to extract credentials that may or may not be there, handle the case where the maybe is nothing, etc. If we're in this state, we know we've already got credentials. And so we're able to pull them right out of the message and then just immediately call save, which is the function that takes the credentials and the current status and then actually results in firing off the HTTP request to record either the new article or the edit to the existing article. Okay, so that's a sort of a convenience. It prevents us from having to unwrap a maybe. But it does something else that's pretty important. The fact that clicked save has cred as one of its arguments to that variant means that we're only capable of rendering a button that has this in its click handler if we're logged in. In other words, we actually can't render a save button that uses this as its message unless we're logged in and we actually have access to an instantiated cred value. Not possible. So let's see if we can take that a step further. So the article page, you have to be logged in. What about a page where you don't have to be logged in? So a profile page is a good example of this. If I'm on the profile page, I'm viewing someone's profile, I don't necessarily have to be logged in. I may be logged in, but I might also not be. Oop, that's not the profile page. I may or may not be logged in. And some of these operations only work when I'm logged in. But they're still part of the message type because there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here that should work when I'm either logged in or not. For example, when I'm on someone's profile page, there's a couple of tabs. I'm allowed to click the tabs if I am or am not logged in. Also, some errors could happen. There could be a loading error, like if the person's articles didn't show up, the server was down. I could get those. I can certainly dismiss those errors, whether or not I'm logged in. But there are other things that explicitly do require being logged in. I can't follow someone unless I'm logged in. That doesn't make any sense. I should not be able to render a follow button without being logged in. And the fact that we have cred in this message is an enforcement argument. It's an argument to this message that enforces that we can only use this if we are logged in. It's not possible for us to have any kind of button on this page without passing it some cred. So based on that, we're now able to look at these messages and tell exactly which of these things can be triggered from user interactions when you're logged in and the ones that can't be. This is sort of a bridge between update and view. It's connecting them by saying, yeah, this is something that update's going to require if you want to instantiate one of these things in the view. Update doesn't even necessarily need to use it. As it happens, it's handy for the case that we saw previously, where it sort of gives you access to it and you can use it right there in update to pass it to the HTTP request, because the HTTP request does actually need the credentials. But even if it didn't, this would be a way for us to enforce, hey, I only want to be able to instantiate one of these things when you're actually on this page. And we can take it a step further, and in fact we do, if you look at the author. So we talked earlier about how author has a couple of different enforcement techniques going on here, one of which is we have the notion of followed authors and unfollowed authors, and we have this custom type that has these three possibilities for either I'm following them, I'm not following them, or it's me. But there's another thing that we have here, which is that this isViewer is using exactly the same technique as what we saw previously. isViewer takes cred. That means that isViewer can only be instantiated if you're logged in. And it takes it even a step further with the signature of the follow button and the unfollow button. So let's expand these out real quick. So follow button accepts a toMessage function. In the next section on reuse, we're going to get into a little bit of the details of how these things work. So let's not worry too much about the HTML message and this sort of technique for reuse for the moment. But the relevant part is all it needs is it needs to be able to pass this button a message. This function absolutely could take this as an argument for this. No problem at all. It would still work. All it needs is some message that's just going to get passed to a handler. But it doesn't. Instead, what it does is it says, give me a message that accepts cred and unfollowed author, and then give me cred and an unfollowed author, and then I will render this thing for you. It absolutely does not need to. The whole point of doing this is to enforce you actually have a message that needs some cred, that needs an unfollowed author. Now, granted, this is a pretty weak guarantee. It's really not a guarantee at all, in the sense that I could absolutely pass this a function that just doesn't actually, it isn't a message variant, but rather is just an anonymous function that accepts cred and unfollowed author and just completely disregards them. But at least by putting this in a type like this, I make it so that it's quite convenient to pass it something, a message that has this type, a message that has the enforcement argument in it of cred. And it's actually sort of less ergonomic to try and have a message that doesn't have that. Because then in order to call this function, I would have to pass some anonymous function that disregarded it. So this is a way that I can sort of propagate this through and make it so that the happy path, the easy path, the most ergonomic way to use these things is to actually create that link between view and update to say, yeah, this only should be possible if we are logged in, and otherwise it should not be possible to render one of these things. Now, worth noting that, as previously discussed with cred, as it happens, the cred holds on to a token, which then gets attached to the HTTP request. But let's say in the future we switch to a cookie-based system, where this is not actually exposed to the application at all. It's just done transparently behind the scenes through the browser's cookie system. Even in that world, I would still want to have these same types here. I would want to have this in place just to enforce the guarantee that I can't render one of these things when I'm not logged in, because that would be messed up. If the user saw that, they would be like, oh, what's going on here? Follow button? What does following even mean when you don't have an account or you're not logged in?